Hello and welcome on this fine Thursday afternoon to another episode of our Facebook Live and on YouTube, talking about Third Mill Institute. My name is Steve Kamer. I am the director of Third Mill Institute. So I'm going to just kind of chat here with you guys for a little while as we wait for people to show up. We'll give it a minute or so, but I am excited to talk to you today again about Third Mill Institute. We're here to really help and find ways that we can serve both our facilitators of our small groups that we call learning communities, as well as our students. So thank you for being with us today, and I will be getting us started very shortly. If you're here today, you can let me know. It's April, and we've got a storm above us today. It's cold out, but I know many parts of the world are having might be really warm in Florida, where some of Third Mill is located. It could be cold where you are. Let me know where you are, and feel free to say hi. So again, we thank you for joining us, and we'll be getting going in just a couple moments. Welcome. If I cut this off, that part goes away. But welcome. My name is Steve Kamer. I am the director of Third Mill Institute, and we're glad you're here today. If you are watching live with us now on Facebook or later on YouTube, it is good to have you with us. We have a hello from Ottawa. Greetings. Thank you for joining us. And today we're going to be talking about the next module 3 in the Biblical Foundations course. We've been slowly going through each module, and the idea here, if you're a student or a trainer / facilitator, what is it that you're looking to expect as you jump into this module of the course? If you want to come watch this first, or even as you watch the lesson, you can watch this afterwards. But what are some of the key points you want to make sure you capture, or you want to make sure the students in your learning community are able to understand? And so we're looking at a brief summary of the module or lesson, and we're going to be talking about what are some of the key things you might want to make sure your students, or you yourself, if you're a student, understand. What are some of the key takeaways? And then we're going to look at the discussion guide and what are some of the things that would be really important to make sure, or some of the best questions that are out there, some of the questions you might want to use. So we're going to jump in. This is lesson 3, which is also module 3 of the Biblical Foundations course. It is our lesson series, Kingdom, Covenant, and Canon of the Old Testament. And as we began this course, we're talking about the Old Testament and why it's important to study the Old Testament. That was the first video. You can find that here on YouTube, and we can maybe repost it on Facebook. The second lesson was about kingdom, and the third lesson is about covenant. And why I think this is one of our introductory courses is because of how foundational much of the material is for understanding the rest of our material. And kingdom, the idea of kingdom is certainly so key, as well as the idea of covenant. And today we're going to be looking at covenants. So I'm going to read the very first paragraph of the introduction. I often find those to be extremely helpful. Just a great introduction about what we're going to be talking about. And it says this: if you were a great king in the ancient world, and you were determined to spread your rule over other nations, how would you administer your kingdom? How would you establish the fundamental policies of your empire as it grew larger and larger? These are good questions to ask as we study the Old Testament, because the Old Testament presents God as a divine king, a supreme divine king who is determined to spread his kingdom to the ends of the earth. Ancient Israelites knew that great human kings in their day ruled their expanding kingdoms through international treaties or covenants. So it was no surprise to them to learn that God administered his expanding kingdom through covenants as well. God's covenants established the basic policies that governed his kingdom as it spread throughout the earth. So in the Old Testament, and we see this through archaeology as well as many other things that can be studied, kings governed their kingdoms by covenants. And so it was no surprise, as it said, that God, the supreme king, was going to rule his kingdom by covenants as well. And that way you see where we get the idea of kingdoms, of covenants, and why God was going forward with covenants. There's a lot of good quotes in here. I'm gonna read one. As God began to establish his kingdom, he was going to rule it by covenants. And Dr. Bradley Johnson said this of covenants: when God comes and makes a covenant with his people, he says this: I will offer you protection. I will offer you prosperity. I will offer you identity for exchange for your participation with me by sharing a portion of your crops, by giving me your allegiance, and by not forming allegiances with other kings. That was super common in the ancient world, that you would get these treaties called suzerain vassal treaties. That's going to be a key concept you want to grab when you study this module. Suzerain vassal treaties. And that was where a suzerain, a greater king, came to a vassal, a lesser king, and offered to make a treaty with them. A treaty, like that quote said, that provided for them protection, that provided for them an identity, that provided with them a way forward in life as they formed that treaty, and it had conditions with it. And we see God do much the same thing in his covenants with us. I'm going to cover briefly what the main components of the suzerain vassal treaties were. And as you watch the lesson, you'll see how these components showed up in all of the major covenants in the Old Testament. So first was royal benevolence. This was the idea that the benevolence that the greater king is giving the lesser king in helping them in some way. You actually see this really perfectly as this pattern is repeated in the Ten Commandments. Because as God shows up in Exodus 20 to talk about the Ten Commandments, he talks about his benevolence towards them in bringing them out of the land of Egypt. And this, by the way, is done by grace. There's nothing the people of Israel had done to earn that, but God shows up and he brings them out. And he reminds them of it before he gives his law. The second major focus of the suzerain vassal treaties was the requirements of loyalty on the vassals, the lesser king. As they were making a treaty, here's all that the greater king is giving you. Here is what is required. And in the Ten Commandments, you see the Ten Commandments right after that. The third major focus of a suzerain vassal treaty was the consequences of blessing if the conditions were obeyed, and then the consequences of curses if they weren't obeyed. So that's a super foundational structure that you're going to want to capture as you're going into the lesson. Suzerain vassal treaties had the benevolence of the greater king. Second was the focus of loyalty. And the third was consequences. You're going to see this theme repeated a lot as you go through all of our material, because the suzerain vassal and covenants are so key and so important. So once you get into that, you begin to see these covenants in the Old Testament. You're going to see these over and over again too, but there are several. There's the covenant with Adam. There's the covenant with Noah. There's the covenant with Abraham, Moses, and then David. And then lastly, the lesson's going to address the new covenant. And the lesson's going to look at how each of these covenants actually were covenants, why the elements of the suzerain vassal treaties can be found in our covenants. And this is the way, as Moses laid this out and God designed it, the people of Israel, the original audience, would have understood exactly what God was doing in entering into covenant with his people, a covenant that was going to govern the expansion of the kingdom of God forever, right? So as you look at these covenants, another little piece, and you can even ask this on the discussion question that's good to pick up on. In these covenants, there were two different types. There were the covenants that governed the whole world. We call these the universal covenants, and there were the covenants that governed the nation of Israel. So the covenants that governed the whole world was the covenant with Adam and the covenant with Noah. The covenant with Adam set up the foundations of the world and human responsibility, and the covenant with Noah set stability for the world as God came after the flood and made his covenant with Noah. Again, the details will be in the lesson, but you want to capture those as the universal covenants for all people. And the second type of covenants are going to be the national covenants that were formed with Abraham, Moses, David, and then the new covenant after it. But in the covenant of Abraham, the people, the nation of Israel was formed, and the rest of the covenants build on each other, never just replacing the one before it, but building on each other with the people of Israel. I think you'll find that super interesting. It's also something I recommend that you would memorize. What are the covenants? Have them kind of locked and loaded. You'll find that on the quizzes. And then one of the important things, there's basically two more that I want to summarize here. The next one's going to be the new covenant. After you look at each of the covenants in the lesson, then you're going to get down to the new covenant. And the new covenant is what happens in Jesus when he comes and creates the new covenant. The new covenant has all the same things. It has divine benevolence. We see this in Jeremiah 31:34. Jeremiah says, "For I will forgive," God says through Jeremiah, "for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sins no more." Then in Jeremiah 31:33, "I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts." And then it says in verse 33 as well, "I will be their God, and they will be my people." This is the good news of the gospel of the new covenant in Jesus. One of the quotes that I think is especially helpful that comes from this lesson, talking about the difference of what distinguishes the older covenants from the new covenant, Dr. Matthew Newkirk says this: "What will distinguish the new covenant from the old covenant is the people's ability to keep it." In Jeremiah 31, God says that he will write the law on their hearts, that he will put the law in their midst, and he follows this with the covenant formula: "I will be your God, and you will be my people." Well, to understand how it is that God is going to write the law on people's hearts, it's very helpful to go to a very familiar passage in Ezekiel 36. In Ezekiel 36, God says, not that he will put his law in their midst, but that he will put his spirit in their midst. And he doesn't say that he will write the law on their hearts, but rather he says, "I will cause them to obey my statutes and to follow my rules." And then, as he does in Jeremiah 31, he follows this again with the covenant formula: "I will be their God, and they will be my people." This is where you see in Christ, God brings the new covenant. He fulfills all of the requirements, and then he takes on the blessings and curses, both of obedience and disobedience, and gives them to his people, his church. That's us. Definitely you want to hit this as you look and discuss it in your learning community. And what are the keys to being in the new covenant, and how does it affect us today? And the last thing I want to bring up is the idea of people. The main ideas in this lesson were kingdom, the history of the kingdom, the dynamics of the kingdom, which we just talked about with the blessings and curses, benevolence, and the people. This is super important, and another concept that you really want to make sure you understand if you're a student or a facilitator or trainer. You're going to want to spend time talking about this in your learning community time together, because who are the people who are now in the new covenant? And what the lesson is going to go on to talk about is people who are in the covenant. Well, I'll take a step back. In the Old Testament, you had everybody who was part of covenant. But within those who were part of the covenant that God had made with his people, the people of Israel, not all of them were people of faith. A remnant, there was always a remnant. Some of them truly believed in God, but there were others who didn't, but were part of the covenant. This is an important concept, a very key concept that you will see throughout many of the lessons. But not everyone that was in the covenant would have been considered, if you will, saved or actual Christians. Obviously, Jesus hadn't come yet, so we wouldn't want to use the word Christian, but it might help you to grasp this concept. Not everyone in covenant was truly saved. How that translates into modern times, we now have the church. And you're gonna learn the terms, very important ones: visible church and invisible church. The visible church, much like the people of Israel in the Old Testament, is everyone who's sort of under the circle of Christianity, the people who go to church, or they're maybe involved in a ministry. They might even call themselves Christians. Those are everybody who basically you can see as identifying as Christian. But just like the people of Israel, not everyone who would call themselves Christian or would be under that umbrella and go to church, for example, on a Sunday, is actually of faith and has trusted Christ. Then there's the invisible church. Those, compared to the Old Testament covenant, are the people of faith. They're the people who have actually become Christians. They have placed their faith in Christ. The law has been written on their heart. Their heart of stone has been replaced with a heart of flesh, and they are children of God. They are those who God has made his children. And so this is important because for those, they have the record of Christ. Christ has fulfilled all of the sections of loyalty for them. Christ has obeyed perfectly on their behalf, and Christ has taken the punishment for sins. So for someone in the invisible church, an actual Christian, they will never face punishment for their sins. They will never face the eternal curses, or is going to be the term that you'll see in the lessons. The eternal curses will never be for them. However, as the lesson's going to point out, for true Christians, they might face temporary curses in their lives. This can be trials in their lives. This can be in the form of discipline, as we see in the book of Hebrews. But for a true Christian, they will never face eternal curses. And they will face eternal blessings. So the blessings and curses, the blessings for those who really know Christ will be eternal blessings, and the curses will not be eternal curses. That's not something they'll face. But for those who might be in the visible church who aren't of faith, they still will face, unless they come to faith, eternal curses. But at the same time, they will face temporary blessings because they're part of the church. They get to hear the word preached. They get to be around other Christians. Other Christians might be praying for them. These are concepts. Hopefully it wasn't too complicated as I explained it here. You'll see it again in the lessons, but the ideas of the visible church and the invisible church are definitely ones you're going to want to talk about. They're ones that you're going to see a lot. And even as I engaged with this concept many years ago, I found it to be extremely helpful to me. Just a few kind of tips about the discussion guide. Again, as you go through this discussion guide, look through the questions beforehand. Which ones maybe do you want to bring up if you're a student or if you're a facilitator? Which ones do you want to make sure your students would really help them to see? What was the most significant thing you learned in the lesson, or something in the lesson you didn't quite understand? This is always the first question. If you're a facilitator, answer this one and be prepared to talk about it with your students. I love the idea of divine benevolence. I love how we see it in the Ten Commandments, that as God gives us instructions to follow, things that he expects of us, he always starts with grace, just as he did in the Ten Commandments. He comes to us he came to the people of Israel, and he tells them, he reminds them of his grace. He reminds them of his benevolence and that they're loved, because grace always comes before the law. And I think it's extremely important. That's one thing I would talk about if I was doing it. A couple questions I think would be very insightful. For whom were the promises of the universal and national and new covenants written? So remember, we had the universal covenants, the national covenants, and the new covenants. This would be a question that directly goes to the material in the lesson. As we know, I've said this before, there are three main goals of our time together in the Meet and Learning community. The first is to make sure we understand the material. The second is to apply it to our relationship with God. And the third is to apply it to ministry that we're involved in. This question, number 3, is directly related to making sure we understand the material in the lesson. Another one, number 7. What practical benefits do we have in the new covenant? What practical benefits do we have in the new covenant? For those who really are in the invisible church and who know Christ, we know Christ. We are considered his children. We've been made new creation. We have a new heart. There are many, many benefits in many ways, as they're saying. What are some of the benefits of being a Christian? But for those who are actually in the new covenant and actually part of the invisible church, this is for them. You can even turn the corner and talk about this is part of what we offer when we talk to non-Christians about the gospel. This is part of the offer of the good news of the gospel, to be given a new heart, that God is our God and we are his people. Another question I would recommend is number 9. How has this section changed your view of people inside and outside the church? How has this changed the view of those who are Christian and those who aren't, and even those who are in the church but only might be a part of the visible church and not part of the invisible church? What this means is there are people in your churches on Sunday, or people you interact with, who call themselves Christian and might not be. One thing this means is both groups need to hear the good news of the gospel on a regular basis. So those who obviously aren't Christian outside of the church, they need to hear the gospel, right? But those inside the church need to hear the gospel as well. There's much that could be said about this, but those who don't actually have their faith in Jesus but are part of the church, they need to hear the gospel. That's one answer to those questions. So those are just 3 questions. Look through them. All the questions are good. As I look through it, many could be used to be very helpful, but I think you'll find that helpful as you engage. Some of the things you make sure you want to hit. You want to hit the idea of covenant. You want to hit the idea of the conditions of the covenant: benevolence, loyalty, blessings and curses for obedience. You want to make sure you understand which are the covenants, the national covenants and the universal covenants. Make sure you memorize those covenants. And then you want to talk about the ideas of those who are in covenant, those who aren't, those who are of faith in covenant and those who aren't, and how that translates to the church today, those who are part of the visible church and those who are part of the invisible church. So those are some of the main ideas that you want to engage with, some of the main things you're going to see, and even some of the main things you want to make sure you understand if you're a student, and make sure your students are engaging with if you're a trainer or a facilitator. So that's all I have for today. There's so much in this one. Many of these lessons have been 2 hours if you're watching the video. In module 4 and 5, they do get a little bit shorter. But I hope you found this video helpful if you're engaging with it here on YouTube or on Facebook. If you have any questions and you're watching right now, please feel free to put them in the comments. I'll give that a few moments. But also, if you're watching this later, either on Facebook or on YouTube, also feel free to ask us any questions that you might have, and we will be happy to answer them for you. Again, thanks for joining us this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are in the world or whenever you might be watching this later. It's been great to go through Module 3 of this Biblical Foundations course as we look at the ideas of covenant. Again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time as we look at Module 4.